I will sit down, otherwise the cameraman will tell me off. I'm Samandra Harkness. Hello. I write about technology and society and do bits of broadcasting and events. And I'm really interested in AI, which is why I'm here. I don't know much about architecture, although obviously I live in a building, so I know something. I'm going to tell you, I don't know if all the chairs have done this. I stole this brilliant idea from an event, which is red and yellow cards. The way this works is that when the speakers have got a minute left, I show them a yellow card. And if they're still talking after their 5 minutes, I show them a red card, and then they have to shut up. I'm telling you this because if any of the audience contributions start to go on a bit, you will see yellow card and everyone will glare at you. All right, so that's out of the way. We only have 2 speakers, and they're both brilliant, which is great. So we'll hear plenty from them. I'm just going to briefly introduce them, and then they'll give a short 5-ish minute introduction, and then we'll have a bit of conversation here, and then come out to you for your thoughts. So AI, artificial intelligence, pros and cons. First of all, we're going to hear from Patrick Schumacher, who's the director of Zaha Hadid Architects. And then we're going to hear from Sandy Starr, who's the deputy director of the Progress Educational Trust, which is a science public engagement body, but actually has a very deep and long-abiding interest in artificial intelligence, and is one of the few people I know who actually understands how it works and can explain it in human language. No pressure. So basically, here we have 2 sides of the sandwich. Is that the right? I know it's probably the wrong. Anyway, here we are. We have 2 experts. We're going to have an interesting conversation. It will include you. So off you go, Patrick.
First of all, thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. And so my name is Patrick Schumacher. You mentioned it. I have my office down the road with a gallery. You can have a look and wander in and out if you want in Goswell Road, 101 Goswell Road. And yeah, so AI is great. I mean, there are various versions and ways of AI we've been engaged with over the years, but the recent it's a huge success of the so-called diffusion models, image-based diffusion models were a huge hit in architecture. I'm sure you're all playing with them already. And so we've been onto this for quite a while. Before you had these so-called GANs, generative adversarial networks, and some ex-student and PhD student of mine was dabbling with them, and you had some interesting results, but not compelling. So I've been watching this for quite a while, and about nearly 2 years ago, maybe 18 months ago, there was this breakthrough with DALL-E 2, where I realized quite quickly that this is a qualitative change where you can really use these systems to ideate and generate concepts, and so since then we've kind of been onto that, and it's been quite exhilarating, and we've built up. So we're using DALL-E 2, but then Midjourney came along, and also Stable Diffusion. So we are avid users. We have internal the Discord side where everybody can see what everybody else is playing with this. But we also set up more recently a research team developing architecture-specific tools, also using Stable Diffusion as an open source system, which we're running from our own servers, and we're building a series of particular tools which help us using these systems more strategically. For instance, not just randomly prompting and getting a lot of great images, which might be isolated, might not be constrained by scale, mass, site, etc. So to target this and direct it much more, we've generated a series of interesting tools. Currently, we're working on. We've just finished a tool, for instance, where we have an API with Rhino. We open Rhino, and we have an automatic loop into Midjourney and back, or Stable Diffusion rather, and back to render out quickly what we're modeling. So each iteration of the model we can quickly run through. And I mean, I had a presentation prepared, by the way, but I realize it's more of a kind of talk. And also wonderful way building our own kind of subsidiary networks. Larger networks to interface with, always relying on Stable Diffusion to take that huge database in, but then having what we've trained up first to give the overall system with a large and long trained up, additionally network, a kind of tilt towards our oeuvre, but anyway, we have enormous amount of material out there, so we are privileged. We can use our own name as prompts and get a lot of interesting results. And then there's a series of smaller networks, project by project. We train up a small network where we know which other project might be a reference, and we're training up maybe for a number of hours with about 60 to 100 images specifically for that project. And also then running whole, I mean, in particular what I find is enormous productivity gain, but it's also a creativity boost. So we're generating not only more options, but maybe options we wouldn't have otherwise generated, and it's quite stimulating. So we get this kind of plethora of options. We can also then calibrate and run through mixity versions, so how much stable diffusion, how much of our individual models, and then see that happening. And we're using this for large urban master plans where you have where you see 50 buildings generated, and you see multiple versions of this. And that's where you realize, wow, we couldn't have done that. Or quickly, now in China, you have a lot of competitions where you have to submit a so-called sketch to get even on the short list. And the competitive environment means that firms deliver full-on submissions with photorealistic renderings. And there we realize that we can use AI quickly to get something out, and also with clients. So that's been very, very productive. But I also want to say that we are working with a number of universities and trying to build, get towards a more 3D generation, voxel clouds, etc., point clouds. That's one project. And also we're training up we're going through our archive and tagging it to get something, I'm not sure if you saw my book, Tectonism. What I find fascinating, that maybe I'll stop on this, that it was wonderful because parametricism, I think, is the epochal style of the 21st century, and everybody should be working on it, but it hasn't caught on so much. I was recently on Design Awards, there was nothing. But if you Google AI-generated architecture, it's kind of 75% parametricism. And then you look at those people teaching it and showing it, and all they have these kind of parametricism results. And that's, I find fascinating and very encouraging. It's similar with the metaverse, by the way, where parametricism is kind of, because it's the next generation, that's what they want to create. And these kind of easy entry kind of processes, but also the young generation, the computer literate generation using it. Parametricism has hegemony in the space of AI and in the space of the metaverse. And I find it very rewarding. But when we have moved on from parametricism to tectonism, which is something which has much more degrees of rationality, where we actually have a whole series of optimization processes like topology optimization or shell and tensile structures optimization and fabrication optimization, the level of rationality is much higher. And the results of the AI system with respect to that are very disappointing. They don't get it. They're missing members, and the members don't make sense. So it's fascinating. So we're trying to train up and get these systems there, but it probably has to be a collective endeavor, because I mean it's fascinating. What really was a breakthrough that with DALL-E 2 and then Midjourney, and that's non-trivial, that you get results which are quite inventive and new, but they're getting perspective right, they're getting light and shadow right, they're getting depth, the detail, the way it diminishes and so on right, and so they be really useful. And because of parametricism being quite allowing for a little creativity, okay, is it the yellow? Okay, so that wonderful tectonism falls flat. So it's another way, but I think in principle you can use these tools to train up, and this system should be able to learn structure logic, for instance, skeleton logic, even if they're asymmetric, and other, if you say tensile structure, that they understand that and get the geometry more right. So that's what we're working on at the moment as well, because we are in the next stage, and the AI is kind of not the latest stage, but we're still using it.
I really didn't want to stop you there, because I'm probably the only person in the room who doesn't know what parametricism is. But I will let Sandy speak, and then I'll come back and ask you those questions. My job in the room is usually to ask the idiot questions, and all of you go, obviously we know what parametricism is. But anyway, I'll come back to you in a second. So, Sandy.
I love all this stuff. Diffusion models, the large language models with transformer architecture, very exciting. But I want to go way, way back and think where this has all come from. in the first place, because I think that's helpful. So, and it's appropriate to be talking to people who are interested in architecture and construction and design about this, because we owe what we call AI to people who are engaged in deep thought about foundations. Because AI is the product of computer science, and computer science is the product of a foundational crisis in mathematics during the late 19th and early 20th century. And people were trying to establish what the edifice of humanity's mathematical knowledge rested on and how stable it was, because in abstract thought, unlike in construction, you have the luxury of doing things backwards. You can say, I find myself already occupying a high level of an intricate structure. Now, what is this structure actually resting on? And it was a crisis because answers were elusive. Mathematicians and logicians and philosophers were worried they would be in a similar predicament to the Chuck Jones character, Wile E. Coyote, when he runs off a cliff in a cartoon and then he dares to look down. And answers were found in the 1930s to these questions, but they were strange and unsettling answers. But what they did yield was a clear, objective, and in a metaphorical sense, solid definition of what computation is and what algorithms are. And these definitions then served in turn as the foundation for a new discipline called computer science, which went on to change the world. Now, with the introduction of AI as a related concept in the mid-1950s, and now with the ascendancy of generative AI as a very powerful and popular technology, particularly over the past decade, I think we find ourselves again in a situation where we have to say, I find myself already occupying a high level of an intricate structure. Now, what is the structure actually resting on? And I don't think we can simply put the question to an AI and sit back and wait for it to spit out the answer. I mean, we could do that, but if we do that, then we will be none the wiser. And that's a common turn of phrase, but I mean it very, very literally. We will be none the wiser. So when computer science was born, circa 1937, one of the most popular films at the cinema was Charlie Chaplin's masterpiece, Modern Times. And that's a film about the troubled relationship between man and machine in the context of a factory assembly line. And what the pioneers of computer science, Alonzo Church and Alan Turing, established around that time was quite astonishing. And keep in mind that at that time, the word computer was a term for a human who performed certain calculations in a pretty unforgiving assembly line context. Church and Turing found that, on the one hand, a general purpose computing device can emulate everything that human computers were previously employed to do, which is why computer is no longer a job description for a human, and I think humanity is the better for that. And yet, they found that a general purpose computing device cannot emulate everything that a human mathematician does, which is actually the question, or at least one way of understanding the question, that they were grappling with when they came up with their ideas in the first place. In other words, a mathematician is not a computer. Now, mathematicians are humans. Architects, the jury's out. But mathematicians are humans. And if a machine cannot do all that a mathematician does, then that in itself suggests that a machine cannot do all that a human does. Now, in a time of 20th century cultural and economic and political upheaval, what Alonzo Church and Alan Turing were able to do was clarify where humans stand in relation to machines. Now, we've come a long way since then, and their model of computation does not necessarily generalize to all the ways we use machines now. And in a time of 21st century cultural, economic, and political upheaval, we have a couple of different options. We can play around with our AI toys, and they are wonderful toys, I grant you. But I also think, either alternative to that or in addition to that, we have to try to achieve a similar degree of clarity. We have to look down and figure out, or try to figure out, exactly what it is we're standing on.
Thank you very much, Sandy. Yeah, come on, Now, the two of you have thrown out a lot of questions for me, so I'm going to ask a few of them until the sense in the room is that I should shut up and come out to the room. But indulge me for a few minutes, because I have, I suppose, different questions for each of you. I'm very interested in the things you were talking about, which, as I say, made to some of you seem like, oh yes, we just talk about this stuff all the time, but what parametricism is and what tectonicism is and what's the difference between them. And Sandy, so maybe I'll throw this to you and then come back in a moment for an answer, is you seem to be suggesting that in looking at how artificial intelligence works and what it can do for us, we may also understand something more about the way we think and about the way we might think and we could think. So I'd love to know some more about that. But first of all, Dila, because honestly, I was quite reluctant to stop you earlier because I was so intrigued to learn what is this parametricism. Even assuming that I'm the only person in the room who doesn't know already what it is. Can you explain what is parametricism and what is tectonicism and what's the difference?
Yes, so it's a new paradigm, and I also say style and architecture because it impacts the physiognomy of the built environment, what you come up with. But it also has a different conception of events which you're trying to frame through architecture. And everything is considered to be parametrically malleable, all the forms you're making. So we're rejecting hermetic figures like circles or cylinders, rigid cubes, pyramids. So the basic forms which even Le Corbusier thought was still architecture was composed of. And for us, every form becomes malleable and particularly responsive and reactive to the other forms which inflect each other. We're also taking a series of systems which are layered, each of them differentiated, and the differentiations kind of scripted upon each other. So there's a network of dependencies which make the whole construct very malleable and adaptive internally and externally. And it's obviously triggered and brought on by bringing into the design process new tools. They're coming out of two kind of arenas, primarily the animation or graphic, let's say, computer graphics and animation, where they were simulating, water surfaces and smoke, swarm formations. So a lot of interesting dynamic and intricate forms where to have a logic and law to it, as well as science simulations, fluid dynamics and so on. And then also coming specifically, then the engineering disciplines picked up also forms of optimization, where you can establish, for instance, you have a building, you know where the surfaces are you want to occupy, and then you distribute them in space, and then you have position points in the ground where you can, let's say, where the loads you can bring, and then there's some kind of AI, a genetic algorithm, finding load paths iteratively which are optimal. So in this style and methodology brings in all these new tools for the sake of optimizing into complex sites and having a lot of structural intelligence. And so that is we've been growing over the years and generated this, let's say, new paradigm and style. And tectonicism is the latest iteration of this, the most mature, where what I said at the end just now, where specific engineering optimization algorithms are integrated. And they are coming from structural engineering, but also environmental engineering. So directly having, for instance, having a volume and sun exposure maps, and then also other buildings there which might have an overshading, and then letting that map drive a differentiated facade component with respect to openings and shading device, and then the elements are highly adaptive and optimal, as well as fabrication logic. So knowing whether you want to generate things out of sheet material, for instance, which constrains the geometry, or you hot wire cutting, which is rule surfaces, or tessellations, which have a certain constraints, and that is also embedded. And that is the tectonism part, which has a much higher level of rationality And that's where the AI systems are not yet trained up to cope with, because there's not enough samples. The world of images they're trained on contain a kind of homeopathic doses of these and don't pick up this. So that's where we are, and we have enough people within the firm who are mostly architects. We also hire some computer scientists, but mostly the architects who are self-taught, but reading scientific paper to get the ideas about computer graphics, structural and engineering logics, and we're coding. We're coding our own software, suites of tools, which you then try to roll out. So we have that understanding, and with some of these algorithms I've been mentioning, we're using over the last kind of 15, 20 years, we know how they work. We don't know, nobody knows, how these huge neural networks, we know in principle how they work, but we don't know what we actually got. They became a kind of black box entity we're engaging with.
Process of reasoning.
We can use them, but we don't know what they, what their constraints are. But we're learning to steer them with interfacing with the model.
That's interesting. It reminds me of, I remember talking to some people involved in additive printing, additive manufacturing, when they still called it 3D printing. And this was a few years ago, and they said what's really interesting here is that we started off with rapid prototyping software, which was just designed to design a prototype, and then we'd print it, but then when we were going to make it, we'd make it using old techniques of casting and drilling and so on. And then we realized that actually if we used this to manufacture the final thing, we didn't have all these constraints about how the thing could look. And we could just say to it, well, we need this part for an aircraft, and it has these contact points, and it needs to operate under these forces. Okay, now iterate and make it as light as possible within the constraints of the forces that it needs to withstand. And they said we would get these things that looked organic. They looked like some kind of weird alien plant, because when you're not constrained by having to cast it and drill it and leave massive margins, actually it turns out if you're just going to 3D print it, you can think a whole new way. So it sounds like what you're doing is the kind of the next.
We've done that exactly.
The
that we have
next
this kind of
stage
3D printed chair, which is super intricate,
and it looks completely different.
But when you scale up with the 3D printing, which we're also doing, we've done this kind of bridge in 2 versions of it. It becomes quite intricate as well. It isn't true that there isn't any constraints, because when you print with concrete, you have usually this layering, and you can do it with a certain angle. And if you want to fan the piece, you have to increase or slow down or increase the speed, but there are always constraints. So it's not that it could be anything once you scale up. In the small model, it feels like you could do anything, but when you really scale up.
And this is presumably where the tectonic thing comes in, where you also have to put in, look, actually, there is a maximum length you can make this if it's of this material, and if it's a different material, then it
definitely.
Has
so there's a whole, one of our guys has a whole PhD on 3D printing, that concrete bridge, and how to do it and how to optimizing it, which a series of tools to use it. But it's still another layer of degrees of freedom in the construction industry. Also, now you have 3D printing steel, and you can print it into space and so on and so forth. And we have a lot of examples. We had a show a few years ago where because tectonism is very much connected with this idea of at schools of architecture, student teams and units investing heavily in robotics manufacturing, and so they're building their own end effectors. And it was, for a while, I was starting to criticize this too much with proto-engineering, proto-manufacturing, but it was good because it came out after an era where we had all these kind of form explorations, and the urgency was seen to start building this and what that would mean. And then you have these large models being built, and then the next level is pavilions at biennales and so on, where you see this. So I adhere to this, and tectonism is very much connected to that movement, or that current in the current architecture. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So Sandy, what does this tell us about how architects think and how we think? And having heard that and knowing about how AI works. What can you see us doing next?
I wish the architect Claude Bragdon was alive today, because just before the First World War, he published a book called A Primer of Higher Space, which was one of the big popularizations of thinking about higher spatial dimensions at the time, brought it out of a niche audience. And he didn't mean higher space vertically, he meant a pair of directions that is mutually orthogonal with the three that we use every day. And I think it's worth returning to that book. I think it might help show us what we could do and what we're not doing, perhaps, with some of this technology. Thinking about tessellation, an amazing thing happened last year, which is that something that people didn't know existed was found, what they call an aperiodic monotile. So a geometric figure that can only tile the two-dimensional plane aperiodically. And previously they brought it down to a pair of figures, but they found a single figure that could do this. And it was not found by an AI. It was found by a so-called shape enthusiast, not even a geometer, a shape enthusiast in Britain. And the ingredients were amazingly simple. It was a juxtaposition of a hexagonal tiling of the plane with the dual of that hexagonal tiling of the plane. And from those ingredients, he did this. And an AI did not find that. It was hiding in plain sight, which is astonishing, and shows us exactly the sort of interesting questions that are being thrown up about the boundary between what these machines can do for us, what we can do with them, for them, don't know, with them anyway, and indeed, and to try and re-establish, to learn from that boundary in a way that, as I said, during the birth of computer science, people learned sometimes disconcerting lessons from that boundary. I mean, listening to you, Patrick, is interesting because I'm getting from you a sense of being able to explore a space of possibilities you couldn't do before. Like it's dizzying almost. Everything. It's like when Alan Turing points out that every possible Turing machine is enumerable. It can be put in a list, and then you start to go, oh my goodness, and it's like have anyone read The Library of Babel by Jorge Luis Borges? So he talks about being in a library where every possible permutation of characters yields a book. And so that's amazing. So everything, in a sense, already exists and feels predetermined. And then you think, hang on a minute, what am I doing here? How do I identify the thing I want? And then do I use the tech to help me do that as well? Has it given me the world I'm in, and now it's helping me find the right place in it where I want to be? And at a certain stage, you have to think, have I ceded too much to that technology in arriving at that decision, or is that not a problem? I don't know the answer to that.
You're actually making me think. I was in the British Library talking to their director of science and technology oddly about ChatGPT and saying, how is it going to change things? And she said, well, we have this problem with people doing research. I mean, even apart from you ask ChatGPT and it invents some articles that don't exist, and you go into the library and they're like, this doesn't actually exist. But even apart from that, she said, we're looking at using it to make book recommendations, to make bibliographies. So we get a PhD student in, so I'm researching this, and the AI might look in their actual collection and make recommendations, but nobody knows exactly what basis it's using to make those recommendations.
Absolutely.
And that's a problem for doing research.
Absolutely, because the problem of so-called explainable AI, people want AI to reach certain standards. Trustworthy is one, and explainable is another. How did you arrive at the decision? And at the moment, that is as much of a mystery, it's as hard a problem as the so-called Entscheidungsproblem, the decision problem, that Turing and Church were grappling with when they founded computer science. So there's a trade-off there. This technology can do so much for us, partly because it's so general purpose and you can't guarantee what it's going to come up with. And indeed, it comes up with something different each time you ask it the same question. And that's incredibly helpful, but the trade-off is that it does things that are bonkers.
So it's the difference between the old computers, which were like a child's, that they were pretty limited, but it might do exactly what children won't do exactly what you tell them either. And then having a teenager where, they're independent, they can do things, but they're never going to tell you why. Okay, on that note, we have 35 minutes left, and so I want to make most of that your time. So I'll take, as you've been doing, a few points, come back to these two. Okay, right, so we've already got 4 hands. So Okay, excellent. 4 excellent question, comments, whatever. So some of it was very specific. So I'm going to come to you, Patrick, first, and then Sandy, I think you could have lots of other things.
First of all, to your question, first, I do think it's empowerment and enhancement of the process, because we have more, we proliferate more options so that search space opens up, and we're still going to be selecting with an eye towards what might make sense, and it's not. And also, I wouldn't underestimate the importance of an image communicating something about the institution, about the place, and you can. So I think the image should be telling you about something that is more compact, more porous, stretch out, embedding in the landscape. A lot of things speak through an image. An image gives you 1,000 words. So I wouldn't deny that, and we have to be quite embrace it and not consider this to be superficial. It's part of the core competency of all designers, that we are designing for the phenomenal world. So how, it's about how things perceptually taken up. That was in industrial design, the designer versus the engineer is doing that. In architecture, it's also the way you're framing an event and inviting people and making things recognizable and understood, and also signaling something, connotations like, this is a very forward-looking, future-oriented, or more traditionally embedded. So a lot of things come through the image, and to calibrate is very important, so I wouldn't underestimate in that. And if you do that better and more rapidly, also for yourself to understand what you might want, I think it's very important. And I think that then the A will never take over, because you will have an architect claiming authorship and taking responsibility for propositioning something. That won't be automated, but what's behind the process, and now it's also, let's say, a lot of an architect comes up, behind him is something which is also more obscure to the outside world, namely the way the team was working, the way they were looking up references, the way they were playing with form, initially maybe also kind of mindlessly, and then hitting on something, and then there's a critique. And so it's not linear, and then but then the architect who stands in front of the client will present something. And if that was selected from a larger variety of things, all the better. So there's a rationality also in the prompting. The prompting becomes more sophisticated. It's more structured now. You obviously can also input already geometrical constraints. So what we input, they can do a kind of color-coded diagram of programmatic areas, and then run them. So it's not a standalone probably anymore in architecture. And I think it's important to notice that it's different from students playing with that, or artists playing with that without having a clear, kind of more structured functionality constraints. And you just need to mesmerize. It's just a spectacle. So in architecture, obviously, that's not the case. Maybe on Instagram, you can get a first hit, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be a successful architect. But I do think, in terms of students, I'm teaching at the AA. We have post-professional students, so they have a full degree and have worked usually, and come back. Yes, we let them use it. For me, it's by whatever means necessary. You reach something which is more fertile. But even in the last project where some students were playing with it, I don't think it played a very strong role, because we had too many constraints posed upon it, but it did play some role, and I do recommend it to some extent. I wouldn't prohibit it. And we really have to be more result-oriented. And if that's the way you want to get at something, because you want to, imagineer and ideate something more, and whether you're looking at lots of other Instagram images or design or running this, it's on the same level for me. So I wouldn't deny that. I would encourage it. Yeah.
Could you foresee a time when a trainee architect would not be ever expected to? I don't know. Maybe we're already at this point. Would never be expected to pick up a pencil and sketch something that would you would assume that you just using
No,
AI?
well,
from?
we do still, we do kind of markup, or people just do, I mean, we're not doing proper drawings. We do scribbles, but they're still helpful. We still, and when you explain something, so we scribble over a kind of printout and so on. So that level of sketch, I mean, that's all that's left, basically, of sketching. Very different from when I grew up, where we had to actually do real drawings and also perspectival kind of sketches. No, that's gone anyway, yeah.
I know, I did worry about that. So Sandy, jump in.
Well, I mean, this point of understanding, you know, does the AI understand that? And that, what is understanding? It's long been a very vexed question in philosophy of mind, and there's a lot been said about it. But the funny thing about holding a pencil or doing anything bodily is it reminds us of what the phrase "to grasp" means. To understand, we say to grasp, and that's a very bodily thing, and it's to do with us being embodied. It's to do with us being individual. And it almost carries a notion that an idea is internalized. You know, we might hear about it, but then we internalize it and do something and then re-express it. I sometimes worry that might be missing from the loop or the process.
I think there's a fallacy there that in a way you ascribe to our own intelligence some kind of clarity and deliberateness of which we don't have. This is another neural network which spits out, hallucinate things you engage with. So I think there is this contrast. I wouldn't make this contrast. I think that there's a convergence, and you can say, let's say, if you say these systems understand anything, well, if they respond back and come back, and it makes a lot of logical sense. What's the difference between you and this machine? I don't see it.
So
I don't see
are
there's
you
a
with
qualitative
Jeff Hinton that you think we're all just vectors all the way down, and
well, yes,
there's
but
no
by the way, I was
principled
when
reason
I started,
why an AI
I studied
couldn't
philosophy as a young
do
man,
everything we could.
and precisely was into a lot of the early foundations of mathematics and mathematical logic, and out of which developed computer science and so on. I looked into computer science as well, and I was reading the late Wittgenstein, where you already get the sense that this idea of thinking, it's so tied down to language, and language is a system of, and you're trained like a dog to response mechanisms. I mean, and you're just kind of juggling these things similar to computer. So I wouldn't emphasize this contrast. This is already since the 50s I discovered they were highly questioned. That
okay, Sandy, come back in.
I will emphasize this contrast.
Human understanding.
I will emphasize this contrast. I will agree with the thrust of what my colleague in the audience was saying, even though I'm afraid that battle has been lost. But no, I do think there's an important difference. I think it would be helpful to remember what a neural network is, because it was originally a metaphor, and a deliberately crude one, that looked at connections in the mind and conceived of a way of building an automated system that had some vague connection with the way minds were thought to work. Now things have flipped backwards, and when we say neural network, we actually mean a machine, not a brain, even though the word neuron means a brain connection. So we've actually got things quite backwards. When it comes to what it means to understand, it's interesting. There's two figures. One is Douglas Hofstadter, the cognitive scientist and computer scientist, who did a lot to popularize foundations of maths, and with his very enchanting book in the 70s, Gödel, Escher, Bach, it was called. And in his view, the fundamental contradictions that gave rise to computer science and other things at that time are the key to consciousness. At the moment, he is having a terrible time. He's been going around saying the latest developments in AI have made him feel existentially miserable, like a tidal wave is coming down on the world. His world's been turned upside down, etc., etc. He's having a terrible time. I think his is not the way to go in terms of picking up what the significance of what happened almost 100 years ago is to the way we think and who we are. Another way to go is with Roger Penrose, the physicist and mathematician who wrote a great book, The Emperor, whose book, The Emperor's New Mind, I still think is very good. There's a computer...
And also important in non-periodic tiling. I mean, just in case in the room isn't yet a shape enthusiast like me and Sandy. Go on.
Yes, he got the number of aperiodic tiles down to 2 before the guy last year got it down to 1. The monotile was his white whale, Penrose's white whale. No, his book is very interesting, but to quote the computer scientist Scott Aronson, you've got to get off the train to Weirdsville before it gets there at the end of his book. So he thinks there's a new kind of physics that explains the way the mind works, and it manifests in microtubules in the brain. But I think the first half of his book is incredible. And actually, the lessons he gives about what happened during the birth of computer science, and how the key lesson is that a mathematician is different from a computer, and how mathematical insight cannot be captured algorithmically, I think that's incredibly valuable. And it does actually, I think, lend more weight to my colleague's stance than to yours. Sorry, Patrick.
Well, I invite you to reflect on how you work when you scribble. I mean, the surrealists discovered already, free association, automatic writing is just connecting up and being triggered, and you generate thoughts which come out of nowhere, and either you pick them up or not. There's a lot of contingency. I mean, I love Daniel Dennett when he started to talk about this also, the way he describes the mind and the processing. In the evolutionary process, the weeding out process it's the way the brain itself works. It's a kind of self-pruning through reinforcement, etc. And then that's the way we learn. And when I speak fast, where is it coming from? How do I control this? I can't. I can maybe reflect back, but I'm an observer of my own, creative productions, like I'm observing the AI and its output. I don't see a fundamental.
All right, I'm going to jump in because
anyway,
clearly
that's philosophy.
No, I think this is great. I can see some of you going, we were not expecting this. I'm going to think about my practice in a whole new way, which is perfect. So I saw your hand earlier, so I'm going to go to you first and then come down to the front. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So you two guys, I'm going to give you 5 minutes each, which will mean we overrun by 2 minutes, but I am now going to be very strict on the edge. So I'm going to start with you, Patrick. I've got me red and yellow cards at the ready.
Well, I have about 10
you answer all those questions in 5 minutes.
I'll just start with the last one very, very briefly. I mean, I believe if intellectual property rights gets in the way of just generating, boosting productivity, creativity in society, we should not fetishize it. I thought that this idea of rational, irrational, you said human beings are irrational, these systems are rational. You talked about emotions versus rationality. And I think I happen to believe that there's emotional intelligence, that emotions, which is an immediate visceral reaction to something, is also aesthetic valuation. They have a kind of potential rationality to the extent that we've kind of been, it represents a bit of a learning process, learning to love, learning to be repelled by, etc. So I wouldn't, and we can get to this as well. I think we can track that and trace that. My headline is trying to rationalize everything, including the supposedly irrational, the ineffable, the way we make judgments. As we want to validate it. At the same time, we say it's the ineffable, non-reproducible, personal. That doesn't make sense. That can't stand up. So we're working actually with a number of PhDs on some of that. For instance, something like legibility of a space. If you have a complex space, recognizing features, understanding the difference between one space and another, and using AI, so image recognition and letting the system kind of tag and recognize features, being trained on one subset and setting into complex spaces, so to home in on that. And the same is kind of navigation tasks and sets, and trying to generate, let's say, algorithms which mimic human capacity to navigate, which is not really finding with certainty the quickest path, but having some rule of thumb shortcut, some kind of heuristic process, and trying to get at that and test it out against, let's say, human experiments, and then use it. You have a system trying to predict human ability to navigate and orient and recognize features and so on and so forth. So that's my view, and these kind of use of AI it's more kind of feeding into science. It's different from just this kind of early exploration. So I just want to come back. In the back, there was this idea. I mean, I'm hopeful. Yes, I think we're already seeing that we are becoming more productive, and of course, we have to be conscientious about it. And we're not going to do cheap spectacles or bluffs, and that's why we have to, when we select this, and also the way we train up and optimize the model. That's based on our own database, carefully selected, and then we're selecting further with the knowledge of an architect we have seen so many things and reacting and understanding what might be translatable and reasonable. So I think that's very, very important. I think there was you asking is am I just selecting? Well, I'm selecting from a process which I'm setting up to begin with. Training up these models, or even earlier on, before these models came along, we had, when you develop, for instance, topology optimized skeleton structures, there's various systems, and we have compared them, looked at them, and then then you set the boundary points, and you should then live with what comes out. It's what Frei Otto called form finding, which is better than form inventing, because when you creatively do it yourself, I think that's also this kind of mystification, or you've done something yourself, but it's maybe based on some kind of set of images you saw, some kind of irrational processing of that, or non-accountable processing. So rather let's say, work with boundary conditions, and we run a kind of mesh relaxation to have an optimized structure, and then we run a series of additional perforations on it, and these outcomes I'm not determining anymore. I'm just I'm selecting a rational process, and then I should live with the outcome, and if I have good reasons to make further interventions, then I can do that, hopefully not with undermining the rationality which I want to accumulate in the project. So that's, really it's important that we demystify this idea of personal creativity. And your question, you said, in terms of the personal oeuvre, and yes, one could kind of critically investigate that. Not living with it, that's who I am, let me do it, I want to be true to myself. All of this is mystifications, shouldn't be able to stand up in the public discourse. And you can't defend your project like this, it's really not right. So I usually tend to, yes, but there is something you have to go check whether your sensibilities, what they're trained on, whether they stand up, critically investigate, whether you should kind of learn some new sensibilities. And I usually tend to see them as constraints. Everybody's constrained by their history, by the tool sets. Every officer doesn't have all the things equally at their fingertips. And when your work becomes recognizable as Zaha Hadid, then I problematize it. But when I'm recognizable as parametrism or even tectonism, I'm not. That's the kind of recognition I want. But I then don't want to be recognized by Zaha Hadid, because Zaha Hadid's version of tectonism is something I fully rationalized through, theorized. Please order the book, Then I don't, and then it makes me suspicious that this is still Zaha Hadid recognizable. I mean, what an unaccountable ingredient with a bias maybe I should overcome, because I don't want to be locked into my personal history.
So sorry to cut you off on your existential crisis. Self-transcendence, good, great. Okay, so Sandy, you have, 5 minutes to just answer everything and send us away with some hope, ideally.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you used the word transcendence. That's a good word. It's better than the word emergence, which is usually the way the phenomena are understood in this discussion, and it's it's more akin to what you've been talking about up till now, Patrick. I'm not so fussed about something, irrational, non-accountable, mystical in your process. I mean, if you remember something, it suggests you've internalized it, and you creatively misremember it. That's the point about the way memory works. And there's a transformational aspect to that. And I'm not convinced that what the AI is doing with the material on which it's trained is transformational. I'm not convinced of that. This relates to various points that were made from the floor, who owns the copyright, etc. I mean, it's a new situation to have people's material without their knowledge or consent used to train foundation models, large language models or diffusion models. That hasn't happened before, so the legal question is currently being tested. And there are people who are definitely losing out on recognition or on a livelihood or on both because this has happened. There are places where people, I don't know if this exists for architecture, but certainly there was a resource called I Have Been Trained that was created last year, where you can try and find out whether you've been included in a data set without your knowledge or consent. Sometimes it's possible to reverse engineer the output of AI and figure out what has happened there. And actually sometimes that reveals that people have done something wrong, because you pick out a hallucination and someone's misreferred to something or made a mistake that shows they didn't read the original material. So there's lots of interesting phenomena happening here, but the copyright question is still being tested. People talked about recycling, etc. There is a problem called autophagy, which is when a model starts using its own output as input. And it's mad cow disease for AI, effectively. And it results in terrible things. It results in what they call model collapse. It results in us being surrounded by an ever bigger pile of ever blander mulch. And it's not good. So that needs to be looked at, and we need to be wary of it. You guys will know this, Newton was discussed in the last session. Who was that visionary artist who created the imaginary cenotaph for? Boulez, right. And actually that's been realised. Someone's done, Boulez, that's it. Someone's done a sort of 3D realisation of it. I'm not convinced that visionary, imaginary piece of work could have been done with the tools we're talking about today. I suspect pencil, paper, shading, fir trees for scale, I think they played an integral role in that process. I'm not saying we can't do something equally interesting, but I think we let go of earlier processes and methods of ideation at our peril. And then the last thing I will say, someone said self-checkouts. So look, you've got Turing and Church who say, look, this is a computer, machines can do this, here's a mathematician, machines can't. So where do we draw the boundary now? So can computers do what someone at a till does, or what someone doing a call center does? Well, in principle, yes, in a functional sense, but no in the sense that you're losing the social value of human contact and the social good that arises from it. So that's a problem. And if there's a lot of onerous tasks that people no longer need to do because we've managed to automate them in some way, in principle that's good, but are they now doing something where they get to exercise their judgment? Are they productively used elsewhere? And if not, what is the mechanism whereby they can organise collectively to challenge the basis on which society is run? I think AI very helpfully takes these questions. They're not new questions by any means, but it really puts them front and centre and forces us to grasp them as a machine cannot.
Thank you very much. Thank you to two amazing speakers.